Welcome to Pop Culture Retro, which was recently voted the 15th best podcast by the residents of Golden Years Retirement Community in Boca Raton, Florida. Each show will revisit some of your favorite pop culture memories with insider and outsider perspectives. Now, please help me welcome your hosts, Moosie Drier and Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Pop Culture Retro. I'm Jonathan Rosen, along with Moosie Drier, and today we are thrilled to welcome the authors of the fun new book about one of the legendary sitcoms, McHale's Navy, called Set Sail with McHale. Please help us welcome Denny, Reese, and Steven Thompson. Guys, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Well, we have a lot to cover, but to start, let's just take a brief look at McHale's Navy. It's such an underrated sitcom. With an unbelievable cast. I mean, I was just looking at the names and I forgot that Ernest Borgnine, Joe Flynn, Tim Conway, and even for a time, Gavin McLeod. So you've both written other show business books before. Denny, you've written about Gomer Pyle. Steven, you collaborated with Kathy Coleman, who we've recently had on, and on her memoir, Run, Holly, Run. So what drew you both to McHale's Navy?
Denny?
Well, I'm the one that actually started the project, and Steve was my savior. He came in and helped me finish it. I had written this Gomer book, as you mentioned. Gomer Says Hey, and my publisher wanted another book. The first thing he asked me, he wanted to do a biography on Joe Flynn, and I didn't think there was enough information to do a whole book on Joe Flynn. So somehow McHale's Navy came to mind, and I knew there was never much written about McHale's Navy, so that's how it got started.
I was a big fan of it when I was a little kid, but I really didn't remember that much. My dad loved all the military sitcoms, so we watched all of them. But then in the 70s, it was rerun endlessly on a local UHF channel, and I became really addicted to it and watched it. Sometimes, in fact, they had it on for like twice a day, and I would watch it every day after school or before school, whichever it was, and became just a really, really huge fan of the show.
McHale's Navy has its roots in a dramatic series. Can you give us a little bit about its history and how it went from a drama to a comedy, and maybe a little synopsis of the show?
Well,
Yeah,
originally,
it was a pilot I'm sorry, Steve, you want to know about it?
no, you go ahead.
There was a pilot, actually. I think it really started out as a pilot. It was part of an anthology series, and it was called Seven Against the Sea, and it was mostly a drama. And I had a hard time finding a copy of that, and finally got a copy. And really, I want to ask Steve jump in here because he can tell you more about it, because he did some research on it and found out some interesting things about who was in it and how about.
Basically, it was, as he said, it was part of a anthology series, because they had all these anthology shows back then. And it was just apparently supposed to be a one-off, but so many of them were actually looked at as pilots too. Seven Against the Sea was dramatic in the fact that it was a serious hour-long show.
I was to radio him, and we tried to figure some way of getting us off the island. Yeah, that'll be the day.
But it did have comedy in it. In fact, it had two of the guys who went on to be on McHale's Navy, besides Ernest Borgnine, were already in it, Gary Vinson and Bobby Wright. But the main character, had it become a series, would have been the lieutenant who comes in and tries to get McHale and his men back into the war after they've been sitting out the war on this island, just hanging with the natives and having a good time. And on the show, once they decided to make it into a comedy, that character became Tim Conway, and there's no way it could have ever been serious from that point.
Well, you start off the book, and it's true, but talking about how McHale's Navy doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. And I think back to when I was a kid, and I had a very different experience than you, Steven, because I'd heard of the show back then, but it wasn't a show that I could find constantly being on in syndication. It wasn't like Andy Griffith. It wasn't like Leave It to Beaver. So why do you think that McHale's Navy never got the big recognition that that it probably deserves.
Well, arguably the inherent racism in the fact that the Japanese are the bad guys, but at the same time, if you're doing a World War II comedy, the Japanese were the bad guys, and they don't use the J word on the show. I think it shows up once, maybe twice. They use the other N word, which is almost as bad, but at the same time, they were trying obviously not to be racist, because the Japanese were our friends by 1962. They were our closest allies, which is pretty weird if you think how short a time that was after World War II. But I think that's what it is. As time went on, in the early 60s, no one thought twice about the Japanese aspect of it, or the misogynistic aspect of the show too. But as we got into the 70s and then the 80s, it became more and more problematic. I don't think it's nearly as problematic as a lot of shows were. And clearly there was nothing intentional behind any of it. But I think that's what happened, that it ultimately kind of got pushed into the background. Didn't get any books written about it, is no longer thought of in the same breath as I Love Lucy or the Dick Van Dyke Show or any of those. But I think it should be, because it really was one of the great ensemble comedies of its day. And certainly just one of the great sitcoms of its period.
Yeah. And by the way,
along those lines, also a lot of your World War II series weren't seen for a long time after in syndication. I mean, it was a while before I saw Combat come back in reruns, which was a serious drama,
Tim Conway, no brainer. I don't know anyone who doesn't love Tim Conway. I'm blessed enough to have known him, and I played his son. But and then Flynn and Carl Ballantine, no brainer. By the way, I know his daughter. I read your foreword, Saratoga, who was named after his favorite racetrack. Yeah. I didn't know that until your book, by the way. But Ernest Borgnine, prior to the show, you wouldn't think that he would land into a sitcom.
Well, every aspect of Borgnine's career is unusual, because he looks like a big burly guy, and that's what he played in the beginning. But then he wins the Oscar for Marty, which is a role that nobody thought originally he should have ever even been given. And then he goes on to do television, and he's doing the anthology shows, and he's playing, rough, tough cowboys and things like that. And he doesn't want to do a series. And Denny, you tell this. Well, I'll let you tell this part.
Well, it's I believe what the story goes is there was a boy, he was fundraising for school project or Boy Scouts or something. He came to Ernest Borgnine's door, and I guess Borgnine thought he'd have a little bit of fun with him. He said, "If you recognize me, I'm in the entertainment business," or something like that. And he said, first I think he told him he was James Arness. And that boy said, "Oh, no, you're not him. I watch him every night on Gunsmoke." And then he said, "Well, I'm Richard Boone." "Oh, no, I see him on Have Gun Will Travel." So I guess after that, he took him inside of his home and showed him his Oscar and said, "No, I'm Ernest Borgnine." And the boy didn't know who he was talking about. I'd never heard of him. So that's what made him decide he better go on television, because television stars were getting more attention than movie stars at that time.
Yep.
Well, I also wanted to, something that I did not know about, and I should have known it, and I think I did remember it briefly when talking your book. He was married to Ethel Merman. And it was like
so 43 days.
Right. Yeah. So what was that whole story about? There was just that so quickly like that.
Supposedly, according to his autobiography, and that he's really the only one who ever laid it out in any depth. Everybody else just joked about how short it was. And in Ethel's autobiography, she has one blank page, and that is the story of her marriage, which Borgnine himself in his book says he thought was hilarious. But great. According to him, they went on this honeymoon around the world and through Asia, and everybody recognized him because of his movies and because McHale's Navy was seen all over the world at that point. And nobody recognized her because she was a Broadway star. And he said that's what did not work out for the marriage. And they started fighting over the fact that she thought she was a bigger star than him, and yet here she is unknown. And he tried, this is Ethel Merman's, this is my wife, she's a big star. Sorry, never heard of her. And supposedly they got back, and she immediately filed for divorce. And I think he actually filed for divorce first. So
It's amazing that no one knew Ethel Merman to me now. I'm just such an iconic figure.
Oh yeah.
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 And
Well, after that, she did a lot of television too.
Right. Well, also, from what you wrote there, it seems like Borgnine had like kind of like a love-hate relationship with the show throughout the years. That he, So what? How did he feel about it? Like later on in his life, how did he feel about the show?
Oh, he loved the show later on in his life. He talked about it in every interview he did and how wonderful it was for him. He did at one point say he wished they didn't do reruns because every time they did a rerun of a show, that meant that nobody would hire that actor for something new because they could just watch him on something he already made, which I thought was a little odd, but he always spoke very, very highly of it. When they, on the DVD, they did a reunion and they had the surviving cast members, most of the surviving cast members at that time, get together for the first time in decades. And they had Conway and Borgnine and Ballantyne, Bob Hastings and Edson Stroll. And they all sat around for just about an hour, just reminiscing about the show and just absolutely loved it. Borgnine even said nice things about Ed Montaigne, who was the producer and the showrunner, who he famously had feuds with all through the run of the show. So,
and also a feud with Joe Flynn. Didn't last as long, but they had a feud.
We weren't able to figure out exactly what the feud was with Joe Flynn. I knew Bob Hastings off and on for years through the various nostalgia conventions, and he would talk about it. And then I would find references to it in some of the newspaper archives, but nobody seemed to actually know or remember what the feud with Flynn was about. We did find a quote where somebody asked Flynn about it, and Flynn said, "I'm not going to say anything because they'll say, there goes that troublemaker again."
Hey, that's good. That's a good Flynn, I got to say. Well, speaking of feuds and Flynn, in the book you wrote about how he hated, I guess that's a strong word, but I'll just say it, he hated Joey Bishop. What's behind that?
Well, he was fired from the Joey Bishop show because basically he was, according to Bishop, stealing all of his scenes. He was funnier than Bishop was. And there was a TV Guide article that actually mentioned that and said that if Bishop doesn't get Joe Flynn, he's going to steal his show.
Yeah.
And he took it to heart. And even years later, he didn't forget about it because he mentioned it on Johnny Carson's show one night. He couldn't convince Joe Flynn to change his mind.
What is the appeal of Joey Bishop? I mean, the man's not funny. I know funny, and he's not funny. Don't get me wrong, he seems like a nice guy, but my father's a nice guy, and he's not funny either.
I don't think he's remembered as much as he should be. I mean, the same can easily be said, that he was such a wonderful character actor, and he appeared in so many Disney films growing up. He was always fantastic, always did a great job. And you mentioned about the memoir that you were talking about. He had such a fascinating life. I would think that he deserves a book on his own. So could you tell people just a little bit about Joe Flynn for people who don't know?
He came from Ohio. He originally wanted to be a politician, and he tried his best to actually get elected in Ohio on a couple of different tries. At one point, he claimed he lost by only 601 votes. Says if 601 people liked me more, I wouldn't be on this show. But he kept trying to get involved in it, and eventually he did, helping out various politicians throughout the 60s and into the early 70s. And then he himself became the second vice president of SAG under Dennis Weaver and I think John Gavin. And he went ahead at that point and did a lot of good, getting more residuals for the actors, which was a pet project of his that he completed not long before he died, but which also led to some of the conspiracy theories about his death.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you about that because I was not aware of that either. We just did a show on autofocus, which surrounded the death of
I
Bob
just
Crane,
watched that. Yeah.
right? Which had all these mysterious circumstances. Joe Flynn also had them. So why do you say conspiracy theories? What kind of conspiracy theories? What can you tell us about the death?
Well, according to what we found out, he literally had been at the what do you call it, the rap party for the strongest man in the world the night before. He drove Cesar Romero home, even though he had been drinking, and they tried to talk him out of it. He drove Cesar Romero home. His leg was in a cast. I don't know why, but if you look at the movie, he actually has a few scenes in the movie where the leg is in a cast. So they had to incorporate that into the film. Those must have been late shot scenes, but they show up early in the movie. And he got home. According to his wife, he went to bed. He had a little something to eat and went to bed. But then the next morning, his son found him naked in the pool with the cast on, having apparently drowned after having had a heart attack. Now, it just seems a little bit unlikely all around. If he had come home and thought, maybe I'm a little too drunk, a quick dip in the pool, maybe. But if he actually went in and had something to eat and went to bed, then how did he get out there and back in the pool? How did he even get his clothes off with the cast on his leg, So it's very mysterious. And add to that the fact that he had been mugged 2 months before in South Carolina, where he had gone to give a speech society. He and his wife were staying at a motel, and he came out of the office to go back to his room, and these two guys supposedly forced him into an empty room where they beat him for 2 hours, took his expensive watch and his wallet with not much in it. And he went ahead and made the speech the next night anyway, but he had a split lip and a black eye. But the newspapers praised him for going out there and giving his all. But again, there's something that doesn't sound quite right about that. They caught the two guys that did it in North Carolina, but they claim he gave them his expensive watch and his wallet with his credit cards in it. So, I'm thinking not. But they chose to take a plea bargain deal rather than face a jury trial. So they got out within 9 months and nobody knows whatever happened to them. So was that something to do? Were they working him over because the studios weren't happy that he got this residual deal? The studio heads supposedly were not in favor of this deal because it was costing them millions of dollars eventually in money. And then maybe the conspiracy theory said that's why he was killed.
I'm not sure I buy it because when have you ever heard of anything shady coming from Hollywood? I'm not sure.
Well, it's ironic, or I don't know. It's just so unfortunate, no matter how you slice it. But somebody's so funny going out on such a dark, horrible moment. And my other thing I would like to say or ask: was Joey Bishop ever questioned? No.
There's an interesting point. I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of funny, I wanted to ask about Tim Conway. So that he had a great relationship with Flynn. You said Flynn did not with Borgnine, but Conway and Flynn had a great relationship, you wrote. So how did he come to the show also? And a little bit about him.
Well, Rosemarie discovered Tim Conway. Rose saw him when she was in Cleveland promoting the Dick Van Dyke Show and got him on the Steve Allen Show. He was still Tom Conway at that point. And then from there, within the first year, he had like 20 different offers for supposedly Jerry Lewis wanted to include him in his next movie. There was talk of him working with Elvis in a movie. And then he was happy just to go back to Cleveland. And Ernie Anderson, his partner, said, no, you got to go back to Hollywood. So he fired him so he would go back to Hollywood. And once he got back to Hollywood, he auditioned for McHale's Navy, and there was no turning back.
Well, good for Rosemarie, but There's no hiding Tim Conway. He was going to surface anyway. She just happened to be right there. He was just too.
She became his first manager, and it was somewhat controversial because she was looking out for him for a while, but then her husband got sick and died around that same period. So she had to pass him off to someone else. And apparently there was a misunderstanding, and they didn't speak for like 30 years. They finally reunited on the set of Brooke Shields' sitcom, Suddenly Susan.
Oh, no kidding.
And they were friends ever after that.
Oh, and that happens, it's such a shame, but then they'll never get the years back that they were in a feud.
And what about some of the others like Valentine and McLeod and Hastings?
Valentine was actually listed as the main star of the show after Borgnine when it was first announced. So they had no idea that Flynn and Conway would take over.
Yeah, but Carl Valentine his roots went back to vaudeville, and he was billed as the world's worst magician, and he probably was, but that was on purpose. That was what his act was all about, was flubbing his tricks.
Yeah, it was brilliant. Like, I'm going to do magic, but I'm going to do it poorly. It's going to go horribly wrong. I'll pretend I'm not in on it, and the crowd would laugh, and it was great.
The old George Raft movie, A Few Clever Coin Tricks. We produce 4 coins out of thin air, one at a time. 4 coins. Are you ready? There's 1. There's 2. There's 3. There's 4. What happened? I forgot. Was it 4 or 5? Oh, Edward, I told you the girl should have done it.
The Amazing Valentine, Valentine the Great. And Valentine, the world's greatest magician, with magician misspelled sometimes. So, but he always thought of himself, according to Sarah, more as a magician than as an actor.
Sarah's lovely, by the way.
Gavin McLeod was still living when I started this book, and there were some rumors about him being ill, and the rumors turned out to be true. He contacted me and said that he just couldn't really help me with the book right now. But I think what Steve and I found out was that he didn't want to probably talk about Nelson because he hated every minute of it. And Steve can probably elaborate on that if you want to.
He resented the fact that he had this very upward going career, and then he got this regular part on a sitcom, and as popular as it was, there were whole weeks where he didn't even have a line. He literally was just in the background, sometimes blocking props, he said. They would literally stand him somewhere to block props. So he was his career just went away. When he finally went back to it, they said, "Where have you been?" But he was literally suicidal. He started drinking, and one night he supposedly was contemplating suicide, and he went to his friend Robert Blake, of all people, who talked him out of it and sent him to his psychiatrist. And he immediately went to Ed Montaigne and asked to be let out of his contract. And this was just after the second season. And he's in one episode after that, and he's in both movies. We have no idea how he ended up in that second movie. Apparently, they just asked him to come back, and he did for that. But
a lot of suicide in people mentioned with and attached to the show, whether it be attempts or actual suicides. Yeah.
That's why we put the little bit at the end about the emergency number to call, because it hit as we were going through it, just how many people did commit suicide or at least attempt suicide. So it was very, very sad.
When you did the research on the book, what did you learn? Obviously, you were fans of the show. You don't jump into this without being very familiar and very passionate about the subject you're going to write about. But what did you learn that you didn't know beforehand?
Well, I think we learned a lot about the relationships between the stars and how they felt about each other.
Yeah.
Also learned, like I was talking about, some of the reasons why maybe it hasn't been shown all these years. But not as much as some shows have been. And that too could be the fact that they were, a lot of the shows, it was a complete series in black and white. Never did you have a color season. It's been colorized, I think, some episodes have. Mm-hmm. That too sometimes keeps it from being shown in syndication.
On a technical level, when I was just watching some of them, I noticed that maybe it was a style back then, or maybe it was budget constraints, but there wasn't a lot of coverage in scenes. If you got 4 or 5 people in the same scene and throwing banter around, the director would frame them all in one frame. There wouldn't be coverage. It wouldn't be now a close-up of Ernest Borgnine, now a close-up of Flynn. It would just be like everyone in one frame, which is one lighting setup and the quickest way to do it.
Okay. Here you are, Captain Binghamton, sir. $4 million, coin of the realm. If you'll just sign a receipt right here.
A receipt for what? So far, all I've seen are 3 boxes.
You're perfectly right, sir. No use in buying a pig in a poke. Tink, open it up.
Pretty, ain't it?
Captain Binghamton, do you mind we hold out a couple of these souvenirs?
Put that back in the box and close that up. Carpenter, see that stays closed. In case they get any more wild ideas. All right, you men, get these crates in the gig. They try and jump you, shoot to kill. Stand back from the money. Stand away from the money. Wait.
We still need your autograph, sir.
Huh? Oh, all right. Sir. Well, so long, Captain. It's been a pleasure coming around anytime, sir. You know, McHale, it's too bad your cupboard wasn't bare. Your court-martial would have been worth $4 million. Well, like I've always said, sir, you're all hype, yes.
By the 4th season, you had Flynn and Conway were literally being played up as a comedy team, especially in the second movie, too. And there was some talk of them continuing as a team in movies afterwards. And they did do another series together, the Tim Conway Show. And Flynn appeared on one of Tim Conway's variety shows in a number of episodes as well.
By 1966, Borgnine was getting tired of the series. He was wanting to go back to movies. He was really just pretty well fed up with it.
Is that why Borgnine did not appear in the McHale's Navy movie?
We don't know.
Well, he's in the first one, as he's not in the second one. And there's some question as to why. My take on it is that was during the period where he was really fighting with Ed Montaigne. He's like, I'm doing a movie, that I'm a movie star, pay me a lot more money, and they wouldn't do it. Because these were not big budget movies either, even though they were bigger than a TV episode. And his version of it that he told in interviews for years was that he was doing the movie Flight of the Phoenix. And he was committed to that. The problem is, if you look at the period that Flight of the Phoenix was made, as opposed to the McHale's Navy movie, they weren't really crossing over. So I think he just refused to do it to get back at Montaigne. And then he agreed to do the 4th season because they did the move from Taratupa to Italy, because he wanted to be able to speak his native Italian because he had grown up in Italy. And that's why he agreed to go along with it when they decided to move it back. Flynn said in an interview that changing it to the Italian set, which was really the Frankenstein set at Universal, the old Frankenstein street set from Ghost of Frankenstein. Flynn said that this will either let it run another 4 or 5 years or kill it. Apparently it killed it.
Well, listen, I blame Ernest Borgnine because I know they couldn't look ahead to Poseidon Adventure, but when he gets on any kind of water vessel, it goes down.
Yeah. Well, if you remember in Poseidon Adventure, it's right at midnight is when the problem hits. And the guy counting down to midnight is Bob Hastings from McHale's Navy.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. It is exactly 50 seconds to midnight. 10 seconds.
3, 2, 1. And the ball drops and everything, and then whoops, then it flips over.
So I'm going to put up here in my background. This is the back lot of Universal. You just brought up Universal. And this is what, the P-73?
73.
And they, I got to say, when you look at the episodes, they did a great job. I mean, people thought they were out at sea, or in a harbor or a bay or any of that. Like, they did a great job right there. And tell me, do you guys know this? Is this the same? So this whole water, I've been back there, but I think maybe millions of people have been back there, because I wonder if they turned that into the fake shark from Jaws part of the tour. I don't know if that's the same spot.
That makes sense, but I don't know for sure. I know they really haven't changed it too much. They've just, reset everything over the years. It's the tours are still there and everything. We found out the other day, Bob Hastings, who used to talk to me about how he loved to go out and meet the fans during the tours. We found out the other day he actually continued doing that for like 10 years after the show went off the air. He's listed as one of the main celebrities that would go out at any given time on the Universal tours just to hang out with fans. And he'd wear the uniform from McHale's Navy.
By the way, I had read that that's part of the Jaws ride on Universal as well, that's featured in there. So I did want to ask you about, you also mentioned about the military comedies that a lot of them didn't do well. You mentioned so many of them, and none of them really did well. Like Mr. Roberts, Hennessy, Ensign O'Toole, even later on CPO Sharkey. None of them really lasted a long time. Maybe, Gomer Pyle, what you wrote about, Denny did a little bit longer. Right. But I'm saying, why do you think that is? It's that none of these really lasted. McHale's Navy was really like the exception for the most part.
I'll be honest with you, some of them just weren't any good. I remember watching Mr. Roberts as a kid, and I had loved the movie. I'd seen the movie, and I didn't like the TV version whatsoever. I did like Ensign O'Toole with Dean Jones, and they had a good ensemble cast as well. They had Harvey Limbeck and Jack Albertson. So that one I'm kind of surprised. In fact, they considered McHale's Navy their big competition. Dean Jones was like, finally, I got my big break. I hope McHale's Navy doesn't ruin our show. And apparently it did.
It did.
Of course, his big break was still to come with Disney. So, but yeah, a lot of the other military shows, Hennessy lasted a couple of seasons at least and had some good episodes. There's like 5 or 6 on YouTube. And
I think a lot of it too was maybe bad time slots.
It's always something you have to take into account.
The series No Time with Sergeants, which in the movie, Andy Griffith had played the part, the main role. When they put it on television, ABC, they put it against the Andy Griffith show on Monday nights.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
It immediately went downhill.
And what about Broadside, the spinoff, not spinoff? I had never even heard of that show.
Oh, Broadside was great. We almost wrote about it in more depth in the book. And I thought a lot of the scripts were by some of the same people that did McHale. So I thought it was just marvelous. But it just, didn't go over. Part of the problem, though, with them was they were sacrificed when Universal wanted to stop using that back lot area where they were shooting both McHale and Broadside because they said they could. I forget the specifics behind that. Denny, you remember?
Not for sure, but I think it was all about money.
Yeah, something about money, like it always is. And that's why they moved again to the Italy set. And so therefore there was nowhere to do with Broadside unless they moved them there too, and that wouldn't have worked.
It's crazy how
and their headquarters when they go to Italy, if you'll notice the headquarters when they go to Italy where they end up staying in this sort of like a cellar was actually Grandpa Munster's dungeon.
Oh yeah. No kidding. Wow. I wonder how many good shows didn't have legs or grow legs, or because they were put up against Andy Griffith show or something like that. Or in this case, it was about logistics and finances and where they could shoot and where they couldn't shoot, and like reasons that are different than whether or not you had the good talent and the writing and you had something there, just create, something will get in the way and it doesn't move forward,
Well, now with McHale's Navy too, whether you know it or not, part of its competition on Tuesday nights was the Red Skelton show, but somehow it survived.
Yeah,
and Red Skelton was a powerhouse.
Right.
Yeah.
I got a question. So they named that show, the all-woman show, Broadside. Mm-hmm. Is this a misogynistic, because we're women referred to as broads, and then this is the broad side of the stories?
That's exactly what it was, yeah. One of the complaints about McHale's Navy was that there were very few roles for women. So again, somebody had the bright idea. Let's do McHale's Navy with all women.
One of the actresses in McHale's Navy was Claudine Loget. You remember her? Was married to Andy Williams.
I don't.
Claudine Loget. Claudine Loget appeared in 2 episodes of McHale's Navy. He's referring to when I said there weren't a lot of roles for women on McHale's Navy. And then she's also in the first movie, and that was her first acting. And she went on to become a major recording star, and then ultimately the subject of a major scandal when she accidentally killed her boyfriend.
Oof.
Wow.
And Marlo Thomas was in one episode. She played Joe Flynn's niece.
Raquel Welch is in an episode too. Bob Hastings gets to hide in the closet with her. He loved that.
Yeah, he paid the writers for that one. Set that up. That's just and also back then, I'm not saying misogyny doesn't exist today, it does, but like in the business, there was this crazy incorrect notion that women weren't funny. Like I think some famous men had said that back then, and then of course Lucille Ball and Mary Tyler Moore and
Jerry Lewis.
Yeah. What's that?
Jerry Lewis.
Jerry Lewis famously said that.
Yes. Yeah.
But even before that, you had people like Mary Livingston on the Jack Benny show. She was hilarious. Joe Davis.
Jerry Lewis was wrong. He was a genius in his own right and all that stuff. But I believe he was wrong. But my point about Broadside is that in addition to anything else that may have not allowed it to move forward, I think that, I think they were still like, how are women going to carry this kind of misconception, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the jokes in Broadside was that of the group of the motor pool women, one of them was a guy who had a female name and got sent there by mistake. So his name was Marion, and he got sent there by mistake. So
what? He just stayed there in this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They kept trying to get him transferred out, but in the meantime, he was just in every episode.
That's cool.
How funny. How funny.
Then towards the end, they brought Arnold Stang in because Arnold Stang was close friends with Montaigne, and they felt that they needed a different kind of comedy because they didn't really have the characters matched pretty much the McHale's Navy characters, but they didn't really have anybody to be the Tim Conway character. And Arnold Stang comes in, and he is loud and obnoxious and funny and demanding. And, at the time, he was known for being kind of a nebbishy character. But in this, he's like the chef of the island. And he was the one that they brought in because he was supposed to be this great chef. And so they kowtowed to him and did anything that he wanted so they could keep him there.
Now, I read there that Borgnine wanted to do like a spinoff later on, like after the war. What was that going to be about, that concept?
Just an idea. I don't think it ever would have gone anywhere. But I think he's wandering around New York City. Is that right, Steve? And he runs into some of the crewmates, and they decide to buy the PT-73 back. And this time now it's owned by a female, and she's sort of a female version of Captain Binghamton. And it might have gone somewhere if they could have made some episodes. But
that might have been what turned out to be the pilot that he did with Della Reese, where he played an old Navy guy, and she owns this boat that he used to be on, and she hires him to work on the boat again. That might have been what came from that. It didn't have any of the other McHale's people involved, but I had not made that connection until you described it that way. That pilot didn't sell either. It aired, but it didn't sell.
Well, I have to ask, do each of you have a favorite episode?
I don't. I mean, I've tried to come up with one.
Are the ones where they try to pretend that the war is over. There's a couple of them like that.
I noticed by the final season when I watched an episode of the scripts, I think were being not recycled, but I think the storylines had been played out, and I noticed the actors doing that thing where they push and they mug it and they try to get laughs that way as opposed to just trusting the material.
Oh yeah.
But Joe
What
Flynn
about
was
that
always.
last season? Well, my favorite would be the last season, maybe the one about the wishing well. It's pretty funny, I thought.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm sure they did. How many episodes a season did they do of McHale's Navy?
30 some.
A lot of them.
I think it
Wow.
varied a little bit, but
That's insane. Which
I know.
probably lends to when I was saying, you just put five guys in one camera shot and to have them do 2 pages of dialogue and cut, moving on.
Yeah.
Go on and stream any contemporary show right now, and you'll get maybe 6 or 9 episodes.
I forget what it is, but there was a show that I heard about just a few weeks ago that looked pretty good. And I'm like, how come I've never heard of this before? It says it's been on for 9 seasons. But a season nowadays is not a year. It hasn't been on 9 years. It's been on since like 2019. So
yeah. Well, by today's standards, if you did the math, McHale's Navy was on for 11 seasons or something.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
exactly.
I'm sure that it got to the point where a season was 24 shows, then it was 20 shows, and then after that, I think maybe 18 or something. That's just don't know.
The modern formats and technologies, I think, has a double edge. It's nice that at any time you can just go find pretty much anything you want and watch it right then. However, there was something exciting about having to get home by a certain time to watch a certain show that you didn't want to miss. There was something great about that.
Well, not only that, something that I miss is back when I was a kid, which was roughly when you were a kid, because I would see you on Laugh-In and we were about the same age. But back then, everybody knew every show that was on because there were only the 3 networks. If I didn't watch something on NBC, I at least knew what it was. If I didn't watch something on CBS, I could carry on a conversation at school the next day about it because we all knew the shows. And like I said, that show I just heard about was another show called Mom. I never heard of Mom. Mom ran for like 7 or 8 years. And
Janny, was that the Alice?
Yes.
Janny? Yeah.
I think it's marvelous, but I'd never even heard of it. And it's by the people that did The Big Bang Theory.
So why was McHale's Navy canceled? What's the official reason?
The official reason was the ratings, but I'm sure the fact that Borgnine wanted to leave was another, factor in it. It was at one point ABC's #1 show, but it was, I don't think, ever in actually the top 10 for the season at any point during the 4 years. But they kept it because it was their big show. And ultimately, it all comes down to ratings. And again, the money, because they were already cutting the budget. You had the large ensemble cast. And if you look at the last season, they were trying to give the individuals more to do. Edson Stroll had several episodes built around him in that last season, finally, for instance. And Tim Conway was itching to do other things. Flynn wanted to do movies. As I speculate in the book, they were hoping that they could go ahead and do a series of movies like Ma and Pa Kettle meet McHale's Navy, McHale's Navy meets Flipper, Godzilla versus McHale's Navy, things like that. And Flynn was convinced that that's what was going to happen. Not necessarily those titles, but movies.
But I get it. Yeah, that's funny.
But then I think what they did was they came out with that Munsters movie, and it didn't do well at all. Munster Go Home in '66. And so they kind of decided not to do any more McHale's Navy movies.
There was a big line drawn between television and movies, especially for actors and their managers and agents would have these conversations. They don't do television, Well, nowadays, Meryl Streep will do a limited series, and so you get the top now in your living room. But there was a thing where it was like there was TV and there was movies, and it is nice now though. There are shows that are like, okay, that's film quality, that's movie quality. Some shows that are done really well, and there were great TV shows, but there was a difference. There was a different feel about them, different look. Much different.
Well, you take this one now, the Tulsa King with Sylvester Stallone. I mean, a few years ago, I don't think he would have done that series. And I love it. I think it's a great series.
What you were talking about was exactly what we were saying before about Borgnine. Borgnine was a movie star. He didn't do television. He would occasionally do the anthology things, but that was it because, he's a movie star.
Right.
And, you had Betty Davis did a couple episodes of Perry Mason, things like that. But it was a rarity. I mean, remember when Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton did Here's Lucy? I mean, that literally was like front page news.
Lucy was, revered by everybody. She was what a trailblazer she was.
Actually, Bob Hastings had some problems with her. Bob Hastings was on a show that episode of Here's Lucy, and he had a prop doll that he was supposed to get to say something, and it didn't work. And Lucy kept yelling at him about it and acting like she had no idea who he was. And according to him, he had known her for like 20 years at that point. And eventually he was like, I am going to throw this thing at Lucy if she says one more word to me. And so